Give us a little perspective since you've been doing this for a while. How has the argument for the resurrection changed from when you wrote your dissertation in 1976 at Michigan State to today?
Yeah, my dissertation was on the resurrection. And to me, here's the biggest change. The year I wrote the dissertation, arguably the most influential New Testament scholar in the world died that same year. It was Rudolf Bultmann, a German, very skeptical. I tell people regularly he was to the left of Bart Ehrman by a mile. Bart would allow a whole lot of things that Bultmann would not allow. Now, the reason Bultmann wouldn't allow it is because he had a different kind of hermeneutic. He didn't think we should be doing historical evidence at all. But I had to write my dissertation because he was the most influential voice. The second quest for the historical Jesus was just getting over his disciples, and the third quest was just beginning about that time. And with the third quest for the historical Jesus, the whole topic of historical Jesus in general, resurrection in particular, started taking a new swing. And I would say it's moved to the right in a lot of respects. Okay. And historical Jesus is the center. The historical Jesus as a Jewish figure. For Bultmann, he was a Hellenistic figure. So right there's the big difference. Hellenistic figure versus Jewish figure, who's Jesus. And that's the two worlds before and after 76.
One of the things you wrote in a Christian Research Journal is that in the past, some of the leading rebuttals to the resurrection were kind of these naturalistic theories. Now it's not a particular theory, but it's more worldview. Explain what you mean.
Yeah, I think that's true. I wrote an article for the Trinity Journal about 20 years ago. And what I argued was there was a brief uptick in naturalistic theories. Okay. 20 years later, I just wrote an article saying, you don't use the word downtick, but today, almost no major critics will pick a single naturalistic theory. And those who do, Garrett Ludeman, there's a few. Those who do, John Shelby Spong, they're older fellows who are at the end of their career and they're sticking out with something they were with. But now Bart Ehrman was famous for defending more or less hallucination a few years ago. One of his recent books, he said, I'm not going to take a naturalistic theory anymore. And I think he says why in this book, How Jesus Became God. He says, I used to remember when I was an evangelical, we wanted people to take naturalistic theories and we would crush them with the data. And I think the data have been coming back again, and those naturalistic theories are being destroyed. And you say, well, of course you say that. Where do you teach again? Oh, Liberty, my bad. Okay, well, you'd say that. Yeah, but that's not the issue. Just read their books. They're not making the theories anymore.
That's interesting.
At least they're not picking one.
That's really interesting. Hey, very quickly, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. This book is not, it's written by scholars, but it's not for scholars. It's kind of for your thoughtful Christian, like an intermediate book. Is that fair, who the audience is?
Yeah, that's fair.
So let me jump.
That's certainly fair.
Let me jump to your chapter. And just for those watching, we're going to get into near-death experiences. We're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin, and Gary's one of the leading experts on both those. But Mike, you have a chapter in there on the primacy of Paul in discussions about the resurrection. Why did you choose that topic, and why is Paul so significant?
That's a great question. Well, I love the Gospels. I believe they're historically reliable, and that's where my research has been the last several years. However, there is a lot of debate over the Gospels, things such as who wrote the Gospels. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write them? The authors are biased. There's contradictions in the Gospels that they're written too long after the events they purport to describe, and they're not written by eyewitnesses. These are all claims against the Gospels, and all of them involve arguments or discussions that are very they go in depth. They're very rich, and there's so many different things to discuss in each of those, especially things like authorship and eyewitness. But with Paul, no one really questions whether Paul wrote, let's say, 7 of the 13 letters attributed to him in the New Testament. They also acknowledge that Paul is quite early. He may be writing the earliest literature in our New Testament. Certainly, like First Thessalonians is dated somewhere between the years 49 and 52. Somewhere around 55, 53 to 57, somewhere around there. So a lot of these are in the 50s. Some are could go into the very early 60s. So you've got these letters written within just 2 or 3 decades of the death of Jesus. So they're early, and Paul was, well, I mean, we can unpack it some if you want, but the thing is, he's really a good witness, because a lot of the objections that one poses against the Gospels, they don't apply to Paul. They won't work with Paul.
And that's a shift where scholarship has gone as well, recognizing the significance of Paul. Is that right recently?
That's correct. I mean, yeah, we know he's early. We know that by his own testimony, as well as being corroborated by like Acts and the book of Acts and what appears to be an oral tradition that's embedded in Galatians chapter 1, verse 23, that by Paul's own admission, he was an enemy of Jesus, and he believed that Christianity was a false religion, that Jesus had been a false prophet, a failed Messiah, and Paul believed that it was God's will. He wanted to be God's agent to help destroy this sect that Jesus had started. So not only is he writing at an early stage after Jesus' crucifixion, he was a hostile enemy source. He also claims that he was an eyewitness of the risen Jesus, that the risen Jesus had appeared to him. So it's not someone saying, hey, like Mark saying, the tradition is that Mark got his information from Peter, or Luke got his information from eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses. This is Paul saying, I saw Jesus, so he's an eyewitness.
Gotcha.
And we can establish that Paul had links to the Jerusalem apostles as well. So we can make an argument from Paul. We can get back to the apostles that when Paul is teaching on the essence of the gospel message, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. And then finally, we look and we see that Paul's view of resurrection is entirely consistent with what we read in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels. So Paul is a very important and valuable source.
Those of you just joining us, we're talking with Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, two of the leading experts who between them probably tens of thousands of hours studying the resurrection. And there's a new book out that Mike helped edit, kind of in honor of Gary Habermas, called Raised on the Third Day. It releases next week, and it's fantastic. Gary, one of the things I like about this book is you start this, Michael, in your opening by saying this is a book about how not only great scholarship, but scholarship used to minister to people. Gary, one of the things that I learned a ton from you is your relationship with Antony Flew, the late deist who went from atheist to deist, and just the way you treated him kindly. Would you be willing to talk just a little bit about that? And for those of you who don't recognize the name, Antony Flew is one of the most widely read philosophical atheists for half a century and passed away maybe 5 or 10 years ago. Would you talk briefly about that relationship and just 1 or 2 things you learned from that in terms of ministering to people?
Well, I'd always thought that if I were going to have a debate or a dialogue with somebody, it would be advantageous to get the person to know the person ahead of time. And my thought was, just besides the value of friendship, that would help cut down some of the snipey comments back and forth and the anger that you wouldn't show to a friend, but you might show to somebody that you think, is at the opposite end of the extreme. So I met Tony in 1985. I was at a series of debates in Dallas, Texas, and he was there representing the atheist side. Now, there were 4 major atheists at that time, all British, Russell, Ayer. Now, Tony, by the other one was J.L. Mackey, and Tony. But the other 3 had all passed away. So Tony was left, and he was, by general consent, the leading atheistic philosopher in the world. We met. We went out to lunch. We went out to dinner in Dallas. He almost got hit by a car. He was a typical philosopher. looking at the world around him, and we stopped on a curb in downtown Dallas. He kept right on walking, and a
Wow.
car was turning the corner. We put our arm out to stop him, and it could have been over right there. I'm serious. But we went ahead and had dinner, and the fellow who sat down with us, Terry Meathy, he was having an idea about editing a debate between us. And he said, "Hey, Tony, what do you think about the resurrection?" And now, Tony had written the article on miracles for the famous 8-volume Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I mean, he's very well known on the miracles issue, only he was against it. These things don't happen. We started debating, and Terry said, whoa, 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 time out, time out. Let's stop right there. Tony, obviously you guys can get along and you can talk. Do you want to come to Liberty University and debate this topic? And he said, sure. And he came, as I recall, it was 1987. And we debated with a lot of students present. And actually, there was a bidding war to publish this book. This is before people started thinking about debates. And two of the companies that were competing, if you can imagine this, were Harper and Row and Doubleday. In fact, Harper sent their vice president, and Billy Graham's daughter was there in the front row because she worked with Harper, I think. They were there. We had the debate, and it was a good event. And a lot of fun. He and I debated 2 more times. But our friendship started that night at the dinner table. And it ended, he died in 2010. It ended with me calling him about every month or two.
Wow.
And we would talk about everything under the sun. He was conservative politically. And he loved America. And was a Margaret Thatcher supporter.
Wow.
Yeah, so we would talk politics. His wife would answer the phone. She was an atheist. She would answer the phone, very kind. I didn't have to tell her who it was. She'd say, okay, Gary, I'll go get Tony. Hang on. And so we were talking on the phone. I talked about salvation. I talked about everything. And became a theist. Now, if he became a Christian, it would have been in the wee small hours of the morning, sure, he and the Lord. Because I have no reason to think he came to Jesus, but he definitely came to God. And I interviewed him in an article in Phil Christie, which I think is one of their most downloaded articles.
That's right.
Because of Tony. And it's called My Pilgrimage from Atheism to Theism.
Wow.
And it was a dialogue, not even so much a dialogue, a little bit of dialogue, but it was a lot of an interview between he and I.
His book is fascinating. He had a chapter by N.T. Wright at the end on the resurrection. He just said if there was a religion to beat, it'd be Christianity. It just stunned me. But evidence aside, Gary, you're just razor sharp intellect, great arguments, but just relational love for people is such a model. And that came through in this book. Mike, you talked about when you started the intro to this book, you said by sharing how he's one of the top scholars, but used his research to minister to others. How has he ministered to you in particular during your initial season of doubt?
Wow. Well, I can say with complete honesty that I don't know that I'd be a Christian today if not for Gary Habermas. Because when I had my initial doubts, and this was my last year of graduate school in the fall of 1985, I had a roommate, Jeff, his name's Jeff Jack, and he was in the Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics, and so he had Gary as a professor. I'd never had him as a professor because I was doing a Master of Arts in New Testament studies. In fact, I wasn't even interested in apologetics at all. It's like, oh, I got a relationship with the Lord. I know that he exists. I don't need evidence. I just want to get into exegeting the New Testament. That's where my passion was, getting to know God and exegeting the New Testament. So I had no need for apologetics. And it's like, you come back and say, oh, yeah, we're studying David Hume. All right, when did David Hume? Oh, he lived, 200 years ago. And you're just getting around to answering him now? I mean, what's the deal? Why are you even interested in David Hume? Are we talking about this guy? And it's like I didn't have any need or use for apologetics until I needed it. And so Jeff told me, well, why don't you go see Gary? And well, you think he'd see me? Well, just drop by his office. So I did, knocked on the door. He said, come in. And had never met him. And so I introduced myself. And he said, so how can I help you? And I said, well, I'm questioning whether Christianity's true, and it's nothing that's really brought it up. I just got thinking, well, what if I'm wrong? What if this isn't right after all? And so he spent some time with me in his office and didn't put me down at all. He just said, hey, I get students in here who question their faith. I questioned my faith, he said. And but there's some evidence for the resurrection. And by the time I walked out of that office, I was feeling a lot better. And then the doubts came back later. And back then there was no email, and I was finished with grad school, at least the coursework. And so, I would call him on the phone, and he took time with me. Like I said, I just had a lot of questions. He'd refer me to books and journal articles to read, but I don't think I'd be a Christian today if not for him, just because he provided direction for me where I could find some answers.
That's a powerful testimony. One of the last chapters in the book by Alex McFarland is lessons that new and seasoned apologists can learn from you, Gary. It's great. Well, let's shift to some of the content itself. I've done some research on the apostles, and obviously both of you have gone into this in different ways, but I'm curious, in the larger resurrection argument, Gary, how do you find the willingness of the apostles to die as being, is it a significant point, smaller point? How do you fit it into a larger resurrection argument?
Huge point. Mike and I both prefer what we call a minimal facts argument. And what we have in common, we use different numbers of facts, but basically the same ones. I tend to stretch the list a little bit. And last time we wrote together, Mike was thinking about extending the list too. So this deserves some discussion. But
all right,
we both agree that the transformation of the disciples is a central fact. I would say death of Jesus, disciples had experiences that they believed to be appearances of the risen Jesus. This was proclaimed very early. And let me just say as a footnote, that is the biggest change in resurrection research is on that topic, where virtually everybody is going to say the preaching of the resurrection began, well, to cite Garrett Ludeman, immediately after the claimed appearances. And Bart Ehrman says 1 to 2 years, we have many. So that's it. And then the next one is the transformation.
Okay.
And so it's one of the ones I use. And I use 6. I use 2 others, Paul and James. And what I like to point out to people, 2 things. I'll just say 2 things here. A lot of Christians like to say, I think probably erroneously, but not well at any rate, that all the apostles died as martyrs except for the apostle John, and he was exiled to Patmos. With that little one-liner you can find everywhere. And we don't know if it's true. I mean, you can rely on Eusebius, who's almost exactly 300 years after Jesus, and he's only got a few more. But I would say these 2 things about the transformations. I don't say they died for their faith, not one and all anyway. I say they were willing to die for their faith.
Good.
That's one point. And when someone says, well, how do you know? You can't get into their head. You don't know if they're willing. And I say, excuse me, I'm not getting in their head. I'm watching where their feet go. And when you go into towns and you go into the same one again, and you got the stuffings beat out of you the first time and left for dead, but you're going back there again? Why are you going back there again? Well, there's a church I have to edify. Okay. When that kind of thing happens, they are willing to die, willing. But the second point is that we have reported martyrdoms of the big 4 that figure in Galatians 1 and 2. Of the big 4, James, the brother of Jesus,
Yep.
Paul, Peter, and John. At least 3 of them, 3 of them, we have first century listings of their martyrdoms. John, a 2nd century listing, but Sean in his book is one of the many who think that's not such a good case for John. But we have 3 of the martyrdoms within the 1st century, one by non-Christian, Josephus. And the last thing I would say is, people say, well, you're just silly. People die for their faith all the time today. And I say, well, the difference is this. Today, Christians, Muslims, anybody who dies, they die for what they believe to be true, or they die for what somebody else believed to be true. Only the disciples died for their belief that they saw the risen Jesus. You go, well, if they did. No, that was their claim. They claim to be dying for the faith in the risen Jesus. Paul said, without it, it's nothing. With it, it's everything. They, to the extent that they died or were willing to, it's a witness to their belief that they saw the risen Jesus. That's the sense in which I say it. Willing, a couple key deaths in the first century, and it was because of the resurrection.
That has a lot of credibility in the eyes of people. Lee Strobel told me that was one of the main evidences that convinced him Christianity was true. But I appreciate in your book, Mike, on the resurrection, you had more scholarly research into this than I had seen anywhere at the time I started my dissertation work. Very, very helpful. Mike, I was going to come over to you, but since this book isn't about you and you edited it, we'll bring you back in 11 years and focus mostly. I just had to give you a hard time.
Guys, you think I could be here in 11 years to write a festschrift for one of you two? Mike, maybe I can be involved in a festschrift for you.
That's awesome.
Oh, I forgot. I'll be senile.
Oh man, we'll be here in plenty more than 11 years. That's for sure. But Gary, let me ask you this. One of the areas of research that you've studied is the Shroud of Turin. And there was 2 chapters in this, in the festschrift that I thought was fascinating, but we don't have to go into the details of the chapter, but tell us, where is kind of research on the Shroud and what do you conclude about it?
Well, it's that lead-in. We didn't give any hints to each other what we're going to be doing here today, but that lead-in, Sean, is great because the 2 guys who wrote the chapters, one is a Christian, a fellow philosopher buddy of mine here at Liberty, Mark Foreman, who's a bioethicist, and the other one is a non-Christian Jewish fellow, Barry Schwartz, who may be, you can debate this, but may be the best-known shroud expert today.
Wow.
He certainly is the owner and developer of the best-known Shroud of Turin site named shroud.com. And the photos are great. He's got pro and con, not prejudiced. But as Barry says in that chapter in the festschrift, and he's previously said in an article that Mike and I also wrote in a journal called The City, which is published by Houston Baptist, Barry was in there too. And in these 2 essays, Barry says, hey, don't get mad at me. I'm Jewish. I'm not a Christian. My dad was an Orthodox Jew. He says, some people say to me, the shroud is an idol. You can't be there. It's an idol. He goes, let me tell you something. I'm a Jew. I know what idols are. He said, idols are made with hands. The shroud is not made with hands. And here's Barry's position. Barry's position is, I got an interview with him in 1982. He's been saying this for a long time. He says, I'm Jewish. I'm not a believer. The man buried in the shroud is crucified. He's Jewish. Why would I be upset with him? He's one of my own. He's a good guy. And I believe he's Jesus Christ. Now, why the image is there? Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know how the image got there. I don't believe in the resurrection. I'm open, but I don't believe in the resurrection. But I don't have another theory for it either. So I'm just going to leave it there. It's the real thing. It's Jesus. He's dead. He's been crucified. And can we just stop now? And that's where Barry ends. Wow. And he's got a chapter in the book. He's not a Christian. It's very powerful.
I actually didn't realize he wasn't a Christian reading it, but that makes sense. So you're pretty, I think I've heard you say you're like 80 or 90% confident.
Yeah. That I tell people it depends on what side of the bed I get up on and whether the sun's shining in the morning.
Okay. So what about the carbon-14 dating? People always talk about that and just dismissed it. What's the response to that?
Well, I'll tell you what, you're right. For the longest time, that was the major argument. That and a couple odd people, I mean, very few, think they can fake it. But the ones who think they can fake it, they send the research in, and it's disproven in a heartbeat. So there's no paint, dye, or powder on that you can't fake it that way. So the biggest comeback was the carbon-14 88. And there's been some great answers to it. But the best one to date came out just about a year ago. And a group of scholars put in a Freedom of Information Act. And it took them, I think, 2 years to get the material. And 2 of the 4 people that did the article, if I remember the story correctly, are statisticians, like basically PhDs in statistics. And here's what they got with the Freedom of Information. They got the dates on the shroud tests from Oxford University in Arizona and in Switzerland, major places. and they got all the dates, but the dates are all over the place.
Huh.
Well, the guys who put the argument together are not statisticians, and they put the arguments together, and they did something like, I know they'd correct me, I'm not a statistician, but the way I download this idea is they kind of average these things, and they said, whoa, this is medieval. It's about 13th century, maybe 14th century. And so Freedom of Information, they got all these dates. And the statistician said, this is one horrible argument.
Wow.
You can't average dates and tell somebody what date this is. Now, I'll stop with this. Tristan Casabianca is the lead of the four guys. He wrote to Mike and I years ago, and he said, I love your guys' minimal facts argument. I'm going to try a minimal facts argument on the Shroud. What do you think about this? And he actually got it published with the prestigious British journal, University of, doing the minimal facts of the Shroud. Now, years later, he's leading this team of statisticians. We just had him at Liberty University in January, earlier this year. And he told people, here's the crowning jewel. The journal that they published their article with is an Oxford journal, Archaeometry, an Oxford journal, and I think the editor of the journal was one of the people who published, or at least favored, the 88 carbon-14 years before, and he thought the comeback was significant enough to be published in his journal less than a year ago.
Wow.
So this thing, a lot of people say it's dead. You can't do carbon-14. Some at least say it's been crippled seriously. So the argument, if that's your best argument, you're in trouble.
Now, Mike, I'm going to come in just a sec. I want to ask a question about the burial of Jesus, what reason we have that Jesus actually was buried. There's a great chapter by one of your colleagues at Houston Baptist, Craig Evans, in there. But Gary, one more question on the shroud. Even if it's legitimate, what does it prove? It proves Jesus lived, died, the way he was crucified. Like, best case scenario, if it's legitimate, why is it so significant apologetically speaking?
First of all, because I teach philosophy, I would not use the word proof for anything in the world.
Well,
I mean, maybe I can prove I'm married to my wife. I mean, that would be really close, that could be proven. But you don't prove things. You only go probability. That's why I say the shroud's like maybe 80%. It's kind of a joke, but I don't think it's anywhere near 100. Now, the reason the shroud is significant here is that the predominant view today in publications. Now, some skeptics who hear this, it's going to turn their stomachs to hear this because they hate the conclusion. But the point is, refute it, okay? If you don't like it, refute it. The leading theory today is that the image on the shroud of a crucified man who had the odd things done to him that were done to Jesus. I always tell people, if you can do an article on Jesus, on crucifixion, don't use Jesus because he wasn't crucified the normal way. But the guy in the shroud was crucified the same abnormal way Jesus was. Okay, now he's dead as a doornail. He's in a state of rigor mortis, separation of blood and serum, post-mortem blood flow. There's hundreds of burial garments in existence. Where did the image come from? Not counting decomposition of blood. We don't have images on linens, but there's an image on the shroud, and the predominant essays say it is radiation from a dead and crucified body who Barry Schwartz, a non-Christian Jew, and many others think is Jesus. And I just read the latest article yesterday. Get this. A guy said the shroud image may be a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus. Because when you break a bone, you say, Where are you going? Well, I'm going to the hospital to get a photograph. You know, that's understandable language for an x-ray. I'm going to go get a photo of my broken arm. So in the sense of, if this is an x-ray from a dead body and it's Jesus and you're a skeptic, you got some problems. So that's the issue.
That's fascinating. Mike, let me come to you. The shroud obviously relates to the question of burial. Now, this chapter, there's one in the book written by Craig Evans, but I know you've given some thought to the burial. What reason do we have to think that Jesus was actually buried? What are some of the debates on that today in resurrection studies?
Well, let me just add one thought to the shroud thing, because the essay by Barry Schwartz just shreds the carbon-14 dating. I mean, it's an amazing refutation or a way to call it into question, the whole process that it went through. So that's pretty cool. So the two people who wrote that essay in the books is my HBU colleague, Craig Evans, one of the foremost New Testament scholars in the world, and a former student of his named Greg Minette, who's lives up in Nova Scotia, and did his master's degree up there, had started a PhD, had, I think, the first 2 chapters in his dissertation on the burial of Jesus completed, and then life got in the way. He dropped out of the program and now sells Bible software with Logos, which I have, and it's great software. I recommend it to anyone who wants it. So, there's, I don't know or recall all the things that they get into. They get into a whole lot more details than I would cover on it. But, first of all, one of the criteria of authenticity, it's just common sense thing, is when you find multiple independent sources that report something, it's more likely that it actually occurred, as long as the sources are independent. And most scholars today, New Testament scholars, will say that the Gospel of John may or may not have been familiar with the other Gospels, but whether or not it was, it's still independent of those Gospels. Most Gospel scholars say that today. So you've got the burial accounts in all 4 Gospels, but of course, if you're looking at and say, well, Matthew and Luke use Mark, at least you have is Mark and John. That's multiple independent sources.
Yep.
Also, you've got verisimilitude here because we know that it was the practice of Jews in that period to bury people, give them a proper burial, and to do so prior to sunset. Now, some will come back, like my friend Bart Ehrman and some others, and say, well, no, the Romans didn't allow that. They would leave a person on their cross for days, and then they would take them and throw them into a shallow grave where dogs and birds of prey and insects would feed off the corpses. But we've got some decent evidence that that's not the way things happen in Jerusalem. So, for example, whenever the Romans would conquer a people, many times they allowed them to maintain certain customs. And they did that in order to keep peace. So, for example, in Jerusalem, the Jews were, you can't have an idol, an image of any kind in Jerusalem. So Pilate allowed for special coins to be made that did not have the image of a person or animal on them. He minted these. I've got one of these coins dated from the year 29, picked it up in Jerusalem when we were over there the first time,
I think that's right, when we were on that trip.
So, and you'll look at this coin and say, well, yeah, it doesn't have any image of a person or an animal on it. So they allowed them to maintain this kind of a custom. Well, another custom was that you had, according to Deuteronomy, you had to remove those who had been hung on a tree and give them a proper burial prior to sunset. And we have evidence that the Romans allowed this. So for one, we've got at least one ossuary of a crucified victim, Yehohanan, that was discovered in the latter part of the 1960s, and he still had a crucifixion nail embedded in his ankle. Amazing. So this was a crucified victim. It was discovered with some others, a victim that had been burned alive. You could see the char marks on his bones. And these were buried in these ossuaries, these bone boxes that are about, foot and a half long, foot and a half wide, foot and a half high. And they put a body in a grave, a tomb, and then after a year, they'd go back and collect the bones, put them in this bone box, this ossuary, and then give that a final burial in that bone box. So there's over 1,000 of these ossuaries that have been discovered in Jerusalem. And Sean, when we were over in Gethsemane, we saw some of those that were behind a locked gate within the tomb. We saw those ossuaries. I've got photographs of them still there and they were produced from, I think, 30 BC all the way up to 70 AD. They stopped with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So we know that from Yehohanan, this other figure, that the Romans allowed them in Jerusalem, because that's where these ossuaries were. They allowed them in Jerusalem to give executed victims, even crucified victims, a proper burial. And then we've got a text in Josephus, I think it's in Jewish War book 4, section 317, where Josephus talks about some or some mercenaries hired by the Romans who came in just maybe 2 or 3 years prior to the year 70, and they killed a bunch of Jews. And it says the Jews in the city were infuriated, because these mercenaries wouldn't allow these Jews they had killed to be given a proper burial. And it says it had been the custom of the Jews to remove the crucified
Interesting.
and to give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So we can see that they allowed this kind of a tradition, custom, to be followed. We find it in Josephus, and we find it in the archaeological record as well. So we have every reason to think, especially given multiple independent sources of Mark and John, that Jesus did receive a proper burial on the day on which he had been crucified.
That's a great answer. And I've always thought the fact that it's in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, criterion of embarrassment, just adds to that he's not the kind of figure that would be invented as well. Great answer. Let me shift back to you, Gary. One of the things you've studied, and I've read your book on this, heard your interviews on near-death experiences. And in this volume, those of you just joining us, we're talking about the book that releases next week called Raised on the Third Day, a festschrift in honor of Gary Habermas. There are 2 chapters on near-death experiences, one by J.P. Moore, a colleague of mine at Biola, one of the preeminent philosophers today, and then one by Dale Allison, a New Testament scholar, a preeminent New Testament scholar. Would you give us kind of an update on where the data is with near-death experiences? Are they coming in? Is the evidence getting stronger? Or tell us kind of where that study is at.
I know this will sound bombastic, but I've said it elsewhere. So if you're an atheist and you agree with Bertrand Russell that the death and resurrection of atheism, let's say the equivalent of that strength, would be no God and no afterlife. If that's your creed, as Russell says, you don't want to mess around with near-death experiences. I cannot think of a field. Intelligent design would come close, but I would think intelligent design and maybe even more so NDEs. The empirical data for these things are incredible, and they're gaining all the time. In fact, I've got a couple books right here. Well, I just happen to have this one sitting here. Didn't know you were going to ask this, but this is one of the latest books. Let me grab it. This is called The Science of Near-Death Experiences, and it's by a medical doctor. Well, you can say, well, anybody can claim it's science, but it's not science. Oh, really? Okay. Well, this guy's got an MD. All the essays in here are published by the University of Missouri Press. I didn't say Baptist. Wow. Baptist, Baptist Missouri. I said University of Missouri Press, and every article in here has been previously published in a peer-reviewed medical journal. Okay, just for starters. And they start by saying, if your critique is, that's another world. You're asking me to believe in Middle Earth. You're asking me to believe in Narnia. You're asking me to believe in Oz. There is no such world. They start out by saying, from the best statistics we can come up with, the medical community, 9 to 20 million people in North America alone have experienced near-death phenomena. So let's just say half of those have had NDEs. That means 10 million people perhaps say that they've been to Narnia or Middle Earth or Oz, and they'll tell you about the experiences. You go, okay, they say they've been there. Yeah, well, I used to say that in the 60s when I was in LSD. They might make some comment like that. They say, yeah, but there are over 300 evidential NDEs where people report data beyond the measurable depth of their body. Notice I say, when the machines say they're dead, and that means flat heart, flat brain, according to the data, according to the machines. They report things beyond that point, come back immediately and report it, but they're dead. And in another realm, as I could give you a lot of examples. Anyway, sure. The key to NDEs is the empirical evidence beyond the line in the sand, which is their near-death state. And in some cases, if you don't have if you're flat heart and brain for a half hour, I think that's more than near death, And there's about 300 cases, at least. There's more now. When I wrote this up for a debate I had with Blackwell's uh, uh, publishers, there were 300 cases.
Wow.
So the evidence is where it is now. What's the evidence for minimal consciousness after the death of the body? That's about where the discussion is now.
Now, there's two great chapters in the book, Raised on the Third Day. But will you hold up the book? Somebody asked in the comments that you were talking about by the medical doctor, kind of a scientific approach to NDEs.
This one right here?
There it is. The Science
The Science of Near-Death Experience, published by the University of Missouri Press. And I'm pretty sure I'm right here. All the articles in this book, every article, and there's about a dozen of them. Let me look. There's a dozen. Sorry, 13. 13 articles in here, previously published in medical journals, peer-reviewed. So if you go, well, that's stupid. Medical doctors never say that. Well, all these were published in medical journals. Well, what is the guy? Got a bachelor's degree in home ec or something? No, he's got an MD. Oh, that's a loser one. Who published it? The Baptist Press? Yeah, if University of Missouri Press is a Baptist press. So, I mean, they're making inroads into places where you're not going to expect data to come up. And that's just an example of a book I had sitting here. That kind of data are all over the place. In fact, it's really changing the world's views on afterlife. Now, what you do with that is something else. Somebody will say, well, I'm a Buddhist, or, wow, I'm going to believe in the East. And a number of people claim that they became Christians during the near-death experience. Atheists who became Christians during the near-death experience. Now, I won't slide it and say that's where they all are. Some people come back and they go, I've always believed that. I'm a Buddhist. There's a bunch of ways to God. I mean, those are interpretations of the data. But if you only use the data, Buddhists stand together with Muslims, stand together with Jews, stand together with Christians. They don't agree on the interpretation, but they agree the data makes it really hard to be an atheist today. So these data are very hard on naturalists. That's the advantage of near-death experiences.
I've got one more question for you about near-death experiences. Mike, in a minute, I'm going to come over to you and ask you, there's a great chapter in the book that really clarifies the testimony of the women for the empty tomb, because sometimes I hear that overstated and understated. I don't want you to kind of state it for us as clearly as we can. But Gary, would you just give us one example of a recent case that you've heard that's documented well about near-death experiences that at least shows the mind survives outside of the body?
Well, there's a bunch of them, and I can do some really, really fast. Here's two in 1 minute. In one case, a woman was, I think it was a woman, could have been a man, it's irrelevant. They're being operated on. And in operating rooms, they're often operating rooms side by side, where operations are taking place. And this person said they were operating me. I was in a tough position. I was up above my body. And I lost interest in the surgery. I mean, I'm up here. I don't care what they're doing down there. And I drifted through a wall. And in the next room, I saw a leg being amputated. Now, that's not your normal kind of experiment, but I can imagine what it looks like to have a leg amputated. The person said, so they're cutting this person's leg off, and they cut it off, and here's where the surprise comes. And they put the leg in a yellow plastic bag and set it aside. Now, when you come to, you could say, hey, what kind of operation went on in the next room? Or this poor guy, we weren't sure, but when we got in there, we had to remove his leg. Yeah, I saw that. Well, yeah, you can imagine. Yeah, but I just want to know something. Did you put the leg in a yellow plastic bag? If I think it's going to be in a plastic bag, I'm going to picture a black plastic bag that I take my garbage out with, right? But it's a yellow one. Yep, they were right. Here's another one. A woman's up above her body, and she looks down. And on top of this medical machine that's 6 to 8 feet tall, I don't have an exact measurement, but over everybody's head. You don't just walk up to it and look down. And when she came to right away, she said, I'm OCD. And while I was up there, I saw this figure, this number on top of the medical machine. There's 12 digits, she said, and here they are. And I don't know what the number was. Let's just imagine 16743 type, 12 numbers. And she tells the nurse when she comes to, write this down. And the gal says, I don't know, write it down. So she writes it down. Who knows what she does with it, puts it in her purse. A little while later, they've got to take that machine into another place. And before they go, they say, whoa, let's just check. Can somebody go up there in a ladder and look? and the 12-digit number was exactly what the woman reported while she said she was up above her body. Nobody else in the room could see it. Even if you'd been up there and dusted it, you would not remember a 12-digit number. She reported the whole thing, and her body's not functioning. Many of these cases, they do not have heartbeat. They do not have brain waves. That's the issue. And if you report things beyond that line of no measurable heart, no measurable brain, again, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jew, Christian, you stand shoulder to shoulder and say, we don't all agree on what's going to happen after the afterlife, but we believe that those people who think there is no afterlife are mistaken.
That's amazing. Really appreciate the update. Again, those of you viewing, we're talking about the book Raised on the Third Day, and there's 2 wonderful chapters on near-death experiences. Mike, you've streamed in a few times into my class at Bio, the resurrection class. We use your book. And one of the questions I've asked you over and over again is what you think is the best evidence for the empty tomb. And you've said you think the women being the first witnesses is one of the best evidences. And I definitely agree with that. But I sometimes hear this argument overstated by people. Can you state it just as clearly as it is? What was the expectation of women as witnesses during that period, and why is it significant towards the empty tomb?
Well, yeah, it is disputed how far a woman could testify. I mean, there's arguments that would say, at least within Judaism, that a woman was only able to testify if there were no men around that could do so, and things like that. We don't even have to go that far, though. It is accepted across the board, as far as I know, it's undisputed, that the women did not hold the same status as men did in the first century. That women are equals is just something that is more recent within Western culture, within the last, I guess, 100 years. But within Roman culture, just to give you an idea, Suetonius tells us about when Caesar Augustus, I think it was when Caesar Augustus was ruling during his reign, that he made it so that women could not come and view certain sporting events until later on in the day. They couldn't come in the morning when the men were allowed. They could only join later, and they didn't have the best seats. You have Plutarch talk about Marcus Cato Utica, or Cato the Younger, Cato Minor. And at one point, he was satisfied in his marriage, but a guy came to him and said, hey, I want to be affiliated with you by marriage, and I'd love to marry your wife. So he said, you want to marry my wife? Yeah. Okay. So I need you to divorce your wife so that I can marry her. And Cato thought about it a little and said, okay. And so he divorced his wife and allowed this guy to marry his wife. Later on, the guy died, and Cato remarried her.
My goodness.
They gave away their daughters, for marriage, for political purposes. You had Julius Caesar gave Julia to Pompey in order to mend their feud, because they were both trying to be the number one guy in Rome. And so this ended the feud, at least until Julia died. So, I mean, women were just pawns that were that way in the Roman Empire. When you come to Judaism, it's not much better. You have Josephus saying that the testimony of a woman was as good as about the same level as a thief. You've got the Talmud says, better the law of God be burned than placed in the hands of a woman. Burn it all, and then blessed are the blessed is the man whose children are male. Woe to him whose children are female. So, I mean, this was just the view of women, both within the Greco-Roman world and in Judaism. Even when we come to Luke's gospel, when the women come back and inform the apostles, the disciples, that the tomb was empty and they saw angels who had said Jesus had been raised, they thought the women were telling frivolous tales. They didn't believe them because they were women. Later on, you've got Celsus. who says in Contra Celsum, he says that who are these people who first report the resurrection? Half frantic women. So the idea is this: look, the role of women in testimony, that can be disputed, okay, but no one disputes that a woman's status within Judaism, within the Greco-Roman world, even within Christianity, although it was much higher within Christianity as it was in these others, the role of a woman was not of the same status as that of a man. So if you are going to invent a story, fabricate a story about someone rising from the dead, something that is already going to be impossible for most to believe, why are you going to make it doubly difficult by making your primary witnesses women? You're just not going to do that if you're going to invent the story. You already have Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, two Sanhedrists in there. Why not make them the witnesses? You've got the male disciples. Why not have them as the primary witnesses? Instead, you have the women discovering the empty tomb, and even the first to meet Jesus. You've got Mary Magdalene in John. You got Mary Magdalene and the other Mary in Matthew, who are meeting Jesus before they even meet the apostles. So if you're going to make something up, you're not going to make the women the primary witnesses for the empty tomb and even the first witnesses of the arisen Jesus.
That's a great response. I appreciate that we're not overstating, saying it's impossible, just saying it's really unlikely and doesn't fit what we know, coupled with the other evidence, have good reason the tomb is empty. Now, Gary, you don't include the empty tomb in your minimal facts because I believe you said about 75% of scholars affirm it, and minimal facts has to have 90% plus the evidence. If 90% of scholars did agree with it, would you include it in a minimal facts, and why?
Absolutely. And by the way, the 90 isn't any figure that Mike or I, that we just stick on things. The 90 is just when you do a head count of the other facts, that's just where it is. Okay. Not that we say, oh, no, it did hit 90. But the two criteria for the minimal facts, by far the most important one is each fact has to be attested from a bunch of different angles. We've got to know this is a fact for a good reason. And because it's a fact, now you can say everybody agrees with you because the data are so good. On the first rule and the most important rule, the empty tomb undoubtedly passes. On this magnum opus I'm working on, there's about 25 evidences for the empty tomb, all counted the way critics count the data, minimally, not by quoting a verse in the Bible and saying, see, I did it. Critical data, more than 20 reasons for saying the empty tomb happened. But when Rudolf Bultmann was boss, and we started by saying, 1976 he died, he did not believe in the empty tomb. And at that time, almost nobody believed in the empty tomb.
Wow.
In the mid-70s. So when I say today, if you went to graduate school in the 70s, which I did, and you were to, I would never say it in class, I wouldn't want to be embarrassed, but I wouldn't raise my hand and say, oh, I think the tomb was empty. Well, if you said that, they would say, there's an evangelical Christian or a conservative Catholic, because they're the only ones in the world that believe this. Okay, nobody else does. Well, when you look at it from that viewpoint, to say that we're from almost nobody back in the 60s up to about 75% today, almost nobody to say, that's a great increase and the evidence is good, but it's not up there yet. So I don't include the empty tomb. I don't think Mike does either, unless he's done something since we've talked last. No, he doesn't. But it's a great evidence. So in our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Mike and I, we have a chapter called, and this is Mike's idea. Mike did most of that book, and he's got a chapter really cool called 4+1. And in that book, we use 4 minimal facts plus the empty tomb. And our point was, evidence-wise, the empty tomb qualifies. Head count-wise, yeah, it lags a little bit. So today, in honor of that, in a way, I use 6 minimal facts, but I often say 6+1. So the empty tomb is not a minimal fact, but data-wise, there's only a couple of the facts that have more evidences than the empty tomb. By the way, for the 6 I use, there are over 1 100 reasons for the 6 plus 1, 7. For the 6 minimal facts in the empty tomb, there are over 100 critical bits of data for those 7 beliefs. That's why people don't argue. And so, yeah, if we could get more head count, I'm all for it.
Awesome.
I think the empty tomb is extremely reliable and worthy of our attention. But because the head count's down, that was the issue for us.
Let me ask you kind of a last personal question. Those, if you just kind of joined in, we're talking about a book that releases next week called Raised on the Third Day that Mike Licona co-edited with some fantastic essays, kind of current cutting-edge scholarship on the resurrection, a festschrift for the work of Gary Habermas. You have been working on the resurrection at least 44 years when you wrote your dissertation in 76. Obviously, you didn't write it in a year, so sometime longer than that. This is more of a personal question. How has it affected you personally or spiritually to delve into this, probably more than anybody alive, analyzing the sources as a historian, as a philosopher, as a scholar?
Yeah, let me make a personal question. I'll say it from 2 viewpoints. Like Mike's example, I went through really serious doubt. In fact, only lately have I been saying this one point. A lot of people, they tell you about their doubts when they were teenagers. Well, that's not true for Mike, and that wasn't true for me. But I considered becoming a Buddhist after I earned my PhD. So I was no kid.
Wow.
I was no kid. I went through doubt for 10 straight years and parts of 10 years after that. 20 years. Okay, that's one thing. Keep that in mind. Back burner. Then in 1995, my wife, my closest friend in the world, the mother of my 4 children, died of stomach cancer at the age of 43. Mike and I were getting to know each other quite well at that time, and I remember he drove a long way to come to the funeral. I will always remember that, to come to the funeral. And she was buried, and it was the roughest thing in my life. Okay, those 2 things, a lot of doubt, and the closest person to you dies. I had just worked through my doubt, maybe, I don't know, 10 or so years before my wife died, and things were just calming down. So doubt for me was calming down. But then this horrible, as I told my closest friends, the worst possible thing has happened to me. Today, by God's grace, I don't think I've wrestled with doubt for 30 years.
Wow.
Not because I'm smart, because most doubt is emotional in nature. Most doubt isn't because you're a brain. Being a brain is a problem for a lot of doubt because you what if about it. So my doubts have been gone. By God's grace, I was remarried, but you know, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, we grieve, but not as those without hope. There's a world of difference between grieving without hope, I'll never see them again, and grieving with hope. This is rough, but we'll be together because Jesus has been raised from the dead. So for me, the resurrection ties these things together. Doubt can be vanquished. We have a faith that's true. And when things happen, like the death of the closest person in your life, there's a final response, not because I refuse to believe anything else. No, because the data say so. And therefore, my emotions have to be brought in line with where those facts are. So I think the calming existential blessing of the resurrection, I'm sure a lot of people would say it's the best thing of all.
Gary, you know, I teach the class on the resurrection at our apologetics program at Biola, and I always read the dialogue you have. It's fictional with God when you ask, why did Debbie die? I don't understand. And you speak back truth that God says, can I trust you? I raised my son from the dead. And that, I mean, students just stop and are moved about how powerful it is to believe that truth and work it into your life. So I just want to say, look, it was an honor to be a part of this festschrift. Thank you for asking me, Mike. Those who are viewing, Christians or skeptics, it is really a wonderful book that's put together. And I guarantee if you want to read and think about historical Jesus studies from the shroud, near-death experiences, the burial of Jesus, you're going to get a lot to think about and a lot of value out of this. So I hope you'll pick up a copy of Raised on the Third Day. Mike, did I miss anything, buddy, you want to add about the book that you edited?
No, Dave Beck did a really good job of putting together a team of philosophers to do that. I put together the New Testament folks for that. The philosophers, they deal with all the questions nobody's asking. So I let Dave dealing with those. But yeah, we were just, we felt it was just, we got a great lineup in that book. And so it's just great to be able to do something to honor Gary with this. And I think people will really enjoy this book and get a lot out of it.
I know they will. It's called Raised on a Third Day. You can pre-order it now. Normally at this stage in the conversation, I tell people to come join me at Biola Apologetics, but I'm going to do something different because we have Houston Baptist, Biola, and Liberty, and what's more important is the kingdom than an individual school. So if you've ever thought about studying apologetics on any level, Biola, I'm biased. I think it's one of the best. Houston Baptist, fantastic, especially in the area of cultural apologetics. And Liberty has a wonderful apologetics program you can do by distance as well. Bottom line, get some training so you can be a resource for your church. Fellows, don't hang up yet, but I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Some wonderful comments, great dialogue. Again, pick up a copy of Raised on the Third Day. And by the way, last thing, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. We have William Lane Craig coming on next week, and I'm actually going to ask him to share some kind of untold stories about dealing with failure in his life, some of the challenges that he's experienced, and he said he's willing to share some stories that he maybe has not shared as often publicly as some of his apologetics. We have an update on Mormonism, bring on an expert to talk about that, and a bunch of other topics. So make sure you hit subscribe. But thanks so much for joining us tonight.